I have been working the graveyard shift at Larkin's Grocery for around 6 months. It is the sort of job that requires little thinking, but lots of patience. Most nights, it is only me and the steady hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. No customers, no interruptions, just aisles upon aisles of food waiting for someone to restock them. Last week, the store manager had called me into his office. He had this strange look in his face, like he knew he was going to tell me something that he wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "We're putting in new security," he said, sliding a key across the desk at me. "There's been some weirdness. If you hear something strange, I want you to investigate the basement. It's likely just critters, but you know, better safe than sorry." I had never been in the basement. In fact, I hadn't even known the store had one. It was concealed behind a big freezer in the storage room out of sight. I asked him why he was acting so concerned, to which he just waved me off, insisting it was nothing serious. Still, something in his tone didn't feel right. That night, at midnight, I finished restocking the dairy section. The store was quiet and still, except for the usual creaks and groans. I headed back to the small back office to take my break. As I sat there eating a sandwich, for the first time I heard it this deep, low scrape, like metal across concrete. I listened, frozen. It was coming from beneath the floor. A chill ran down my spine as it abruptly stopped just as fast. Your mind is racing through explanations. Maybe it's the pipes, maybe it's some kind of older equipment malfunctioning. And then it started again, this time even louder. My mind jumped to the manager's ambiguous warning about the basement. I grasped the key, and my heart began to pound in my chest. I told myself it must be nothing and that overreacting was just plain stupid. But this feeling of unease clung to me like a second skin as I made my way through the dark back hall toward the hidden door. The freezer was heavier than I had anticipated. It screeched as I moved it out of the way to reveal a narrow door behind it. It was locked with an old, rusted padlock that really looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. I fumbled with shaking hands and unlocked it, pulling the door open. The smell hit me first. Damp and musty, something had been festering down there for a while. The staircase leading into the basement was steep, disappearing into the dark below. I stood at the top, staring down, trying to tell myself to just go back to my sandwich. But that scratching sound came again this time. It sounded closer. I didn't think another second but fetched a flashlight from the wall and started downstairs. Every step groaned under me, air growing heavier and colder with every descent. The basement walls were made of unfinished concrete, cracked in some places, with dark stains running down them. I lit up the flashlight, its weak beam hardly cutting into thick shadows. I hadn't even reached the bottom of the stairs when the door slammed shut behind me. The door slamming shut seemed to reverberate up the stairs, the heavy thud dripping through the concrete walls. My immediate reaction was to turn and run back upstairs, but then, turning around, I saw the door wasn't just shut, it was locked. The padlock hung in its place, as if I'd never touched it. A wave of panic ran through my body as I brusquely rattled at the handle, hoping it had only jammed. Yet it didn't budge a fraction of an inch. Cold sweat oozed down my back. I was trapped. The scratching began again, this time not in the floor. A reverberation of sorts from the darkness below me, a prolonged grind, really, as if something or someone was stirring heavy things around. I gripped the flashlight a little more tightly, and knowing I didn't have a choice, I descended deeper into the basement. I went down slow, each step taking me farther from the security of the store above me. My flashlight flickered as I reached the bottom, revealing a huge, open space. Much larger than what I had anticipated and far bigger than should exist beneath a simple grocery store. The floor was irregular, cracked in places, and water pattered from the ceiling in a steady, rhythmic plop. I scanned the space, my pulse thrumming in my throat. There were rows of old shelving, most of them rusted and bent, like they hadn't been touched in decades. And yet, in the far corner, there was something else, a large metal door, half buried into the wall itself. It was old, bolted shut, stained with rust. The door didn't belong. Far too industrial, too ominous, for a grocery store. As I drew closer, that terrible scratching noise kicked in again, this time more clearly and loudly. It was emanating from behind the door. I stood there frozen, looking at the metal, trying to make sense of what I could hear. Then, right on cue, it stopped. A dead silence filled the room, just pure silence so strong that I could hear my own ragged breathing. The air seemed to vibrate with tension. I started to turn away, perhaps to run back up and try forcing open the locked door again. But a sound froze me in my tracks. A low guttural groan no machine or animal could have uttered. It echoed from the other side of the door. It was a voice, all right twisted and distorted, as if it had been locked up down here for years. I retreated backward, my heart thumping against my ribs. My flashlight flickered again, and during the split second of darkness it caused, I glimpsed it, something moved behind the door. A shadow. Faint, but unmistakable. Something was behind the metal, and it wasn't human. A wave of nausea hit me, and I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. In the process of backing away, I tripped over something heavy laid on the floor. Wheeling the light toward it, I expected to see some discarded equipment or maybe a stack of forgotten boxes. Instead, the beam fell on a door. Another door. It was this one, flush with the ground A hatch, really covered in dirt and grime, like it had been intentionally hidden. It looked older, even, than the store itself, and the hinges were so rusted it seemed impossible it could ever open again. But as I was staring down at it, something inside my head just clicked. And the scraping wasn't coming from behind the metal door in the wall. It was also coming from beneath this hatch. My breath caught in my throat as the scraping started again, louder this time. But this time, it wasn't just a noise. The hatch quivered. Something was beneath it, pushing, straining, trying to break through. I dropped the flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came out of my lips. I took one final step backward, my eyes locked on the quivering hatch. Then, as if summoned by my fear, the hatch burst open. The hatch blew upward in a deafening crash, heaving a cold musty gust of air into the room. I tumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet and crashing to the floor. My flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering wildly across the ceiling, casting warped shadows that seemed to dance like twisted figures. Nothing moved for a long time. The basement was still, except for the soft, intermittent sound of water dripping from the ceiling. But the hatch lay wide open, disclosing only a pitch-black void beneath it. I crawled toward the flashlight, my breathing ragged, desperate to get out. Just as my fingers grazed the handle, I heard it, a soft shuffling noise, like feet scraping over concrete. It was coming from the hole beneath the hatch. I stood frozen, almost unable to move. The sound got louder, closer, and resembled the image of something slowly dragging itself up from below. My mind tried repeatedly to find some sort of meaning behind what was happening, but nothing seemed to fit into place. This was supposed to be a very normal basement for a grocery store. There shouldn't be any secret hatches or strange noises. And definitely nothing like this. I took the flashlight between my shaking hands and pointed it towards the open hatch. The light managed to pierce the darkness, and I caught a glimpse of the top of a ladder that led down to what looked to be an impossibly deep pit. Then, I saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, grasped the edge of the hatch. The skin was drawn tightly over the bones, yellowed and cracked, as if it had been rotting for years. The hand jerked, then tugged upward, showing more of the creature. It was humanoid, but barely. Its skin was mottled and decaying, patches of flesh missing altogether. Its long, twisted limbs were too thin, too unnatural, as if this were a creature that had been starved for centuries. And its face, God, its face. It was gaunt, hollowed out, with deep, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. A twisted grin stretched across its withered lips, exposing jagged, shattered teeth in a macabre grimace. It moved slowly, methodically, crawling out of the hatch with grotesque, jerking motions. Every movement sent a sickening crack through the air, as if its bones were grinding together in resistance as it dragged itself forward. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind shrieking at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in front of me. It let out a low, rasping breath, its chest heaving with unnatural force, and then it spoke. "Help. Me." The voice was distorted, a warped, inhuman sound that seemed to reverberate off the cold walls of the basement. The creature's mouth barely moved while uttering the words, and yet the plea seemed almost palpable, desperate, as if it had been waiting for someone to hear it for a long, long time. I scrambled backward, finally getting control of my legs. My pulse was racing so fast, I thought my heart might explode. The head of the creature snapped towards me, its gaze locking on mine with eyes that weren't there. It pulled itself closer, twisted fingers clawing at the concrete floor, grooves cut into the ground. "Help. Me," it repeated, slurring and breaking the words, as if forcing the syllables out of a throat that hadn't spoken in years. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't. In a surge of adrenaline, I forced myself to my feet and ran, not knowing where I was going, only knowing I had to get away from that thing. I barreled up the stairs, threw my full weight against the locked door at the top, screaming and pounding as hard as I could. But the door refused to budge. The padlock held firm, taunting me. Behind me, I heard the creature stirring again, this time with greater urgency. The scrape of its claws against the concrete floor was louder now, more frenzied, as it dragged itself toward the stairs. I turned my back pressed against the door and let the flashlight slip from my grasp, clatter on the floor, casting inequitable beams of light across the steps. It had gained the bottom of the staircase, its face raised upwards and grinning that ghastly grin. It suddenly lurched ahead, scrambling up the stairs on all fours, its limbs twisting in a way that was unnatural to be sure. I screamed, banging on the door praying for any kind of miracle. The last thing I saw, before closing my eyes, was this creature lunging towards me, mouth open, as if ready to devour me whole. I don't know when the pounding stopped or how long I'd stood there, frozen against the locked door. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. Down in that cellar, the progress of time had utterly ceased to mean anything. My heart was the only thing still connected to the real world, every thud a sharp-edged warning I was alive. Barely. But the monster hadn't gotten to me. I opened my eyes, expecting it to be inches from my face, ready to rip me to shreds. But there was nothing. The flashlight lay discarded on the stairs, its beam splintering weakly against the concrete walls. The air was heavy with the stink of rot and decay, but the creature was gone. I swallowed hard, hearing my unsteady breathing. My mind raced trying to find some kind of explanation. Hallucination? A trick of the shadows in this accursed basement? No. I'd seen it, heard it, felt the cold, dead air as it crawled toward me. It was too real. But it was silent now, the cellar quiet. I summoned my last remaining courage and leaned slowly over to pick up the flashlight. And as I did, a low groan came from behind me. My heart leaped to my throat as I turned, shining that feeble beam toward the door. And to my complete and total astonishment, the padlock was gone. The door was ajar, a fraction of an inch, as if it had never been locked at all. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing the flashlight, I shoved the door open and ran through it, desperate for escape. The cool air of the grocery store's backroom hit me like a wave of relief, but something was wrong. Above me, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Everything felt off. The cells seemed different, older, they acted as if they had not been touched in years. The air was thick with dust, suffocating, and the boxes lining the walls were grimed over. It was as if I had walked into a version of this store that had sat abandoned for decades. I raced to the front of the store, but the moment I stepped into the main aisle, I stopped dead in my tracks. The aisles were in shambles. There were products all over the floor, many of them ripped open, as if some person or thing had torn through them in a rage. The registers were knocked over, and shattered glass crunched beneath my feet as I moved forward. And then I saw the blood. It lay smeared in wide, uneven swaths across the floor in the direction of the entrance. My stomach churning, I forced myself to follow the trail, as my mind shrieked for an explanation. I neared the automatic sliding glass doors and saw something else, a figure huddled against the glass, half concealed by an overturned merchandise display. It was the store manager. His body was twisted, his limbs tangled in ways that were unnatural. His face was screwed up into a frozen scream, eyes wide but empty, staring at nothing. Blood soaked into his clothes, pooling around him in dark, sticky puddles. I felt bile rise in my throat as I slowly backed away, shaking uncontrollably. Then, again, I heard it. That voice. Help. Me. It was faint, a whispered distortion that seemed to emanate from the recesses of the store. I pivoted, shining the flashlight beam down back aisles, but there was nothing there, only shelving and darkness. But the voice did not stop. Repeated over and over a haunted, broken plea that hung over the store. Now my legs were moving on their own, carrying me backward in the direction of the storage room, the basement door. I didn't want to go back. Every fiber in my body screamed for me to run, to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But there was something pulling me, something which I couldn't explain, and it was far stronger than fear. I was once more at the door to the basement, except this time not just the hatch was open. That old metal door, which I remembered running across downstairs, the one bolted into the wall, was open now as well, with a dark, yawning tunnel beyond it. The air was colder here, heavier, as if the very space beneath the store had shifted into something else, something wrong. The voice called out again, louder this time. Help. Me. I shone the flashlight down the tunnel. Its beam cut barely through the darkness to reveal only a long, descending corridor. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my legs conveyed me forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was wading deeper into something I couldn't escape. I don't know why I kept going, curiosity maybe, or perhaps a hold from the voice. And as I went deeper into the tunnel, I started to realize the truth that this wasn't just a basement but something far more ancient, far darker than anything I could have ever imagined. And whatever was down there, it was waiting for me. It was a smothering maze of damp stone and echoing silence, extending right before me. My weak flashlight had become no more than a flicker now, the battery was dying, as surely as my hope was. The walls were close, and the air was too thick to breathe. And I couldn't shake off this nagging feeling that I was not alone, that something invisible was watching me, following just out of view. The voice had stopped, but the feeling of oppression hadn't, that this place was drawing me deeper into a nightmare. I came to a bend in the tunnel and saw it ahead, an opening with a faint glow. The light was soft, all but inviting, casting long, dancing shadows over the rough stone walls. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering against my chest. But what I'd found wasn't just a room, it was one great underground chamber, one that had to be far too large to fit under the grocery store. The ceiling arched impossibly high to vanish into darkness, the walls lined with deep carvings of strange and intricate symbols. At the center lay an altar, things that shouldn't exist. A ring of candles around the altar seemed to be the source of the light, their flames dancing even though the air was still. And lying on the altar, shrouded in tattered cloth, was a figure. I took a step closer, my body almost working out of a volition of its own, as if some unseen force pulled me to the altar. The figure did not move, wrapped in an ancient-appearing burial shroud older than anything I had ever seen. My heart was racing, a sickening mixture of dread and fascination taking hold. As I approached the altar, the air around me began to throb with some unnatural energy, a low hum, growing louder as I drew closer. I stuttered out, my hand shaking, reaching out for the shrouded figure. My fingers paused just inches above the cloth as I heard it again, the voice. "Help me." But this time, it wasn't distorted, it wasn't distant. It was right in my ear. I stumbled backward a few paces, my breath in gasps, but the figure on the altar remained absolutely still. The voice had come from it, the thing beneath that tarp was the origin of it all. My brain was screaming at me to run, to get out of that room before I made it any worse. Yet the altar seemed to be tugging at me, inexorably. I had to know. I had to see what was under that shroud. I breathed deeply, grasped the edge of the cloth, and pulled. The moment it fell, I wished I hadn't. The figure beneath was not human, or at any rate, not anymore. Its skin was blackened and shriveled, taut over a skeleton frame. Empty eye sockets stared back at me from a face frozen in an eternal scream of agony, the mouth warped into a grotesque grin. Yet for all that it appeared as a long-decayed corpse, I could feel it. Feel it watching me. I stumbled back, dropping the cloth. The candles around the altar flickered violently, the flames growing taller, casting wild shadows across the chamber. The hum in the air grew louder, more intense, vibrating through my skull until I thought I might pass out. Then the thing on the altar moved. Its bony hand twitched, the fingers curling inward with a sickening crack. The grin on its face seemed to stretch wider, as if mocking me. I was paralyzed, my mind screaming in terror as the corpse slowly began to sit up. The cloth fell away completely now, revealing its full horrible form, a twisted mockery of a human being, its limbs too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. "Help me," it whispered, but there was no plead anymore in its voice. It was scoffing at me, teasing me. The thing swung its legs over the edge of the altar and stood, towering over me. Its eyeless sockets locked onto mine, and a cold, suffocating dread wrapped around my heart. It wasn't just a creature. It was something far older, far more powerful than anything I could comprehend. It had been waiting trapped beneath the store for God knows how long, and now it was free. I took several steps back, my body shaking uncontrollably, but it did not move. It remained just there, its twisted grin growing bigger by the second. "Help me," it rasped once more, this time louder, its echo taking on a life of its own off the walls of the chamber. I spun and ran, sprinting back through the tunnel, no longer caring if the flashlight went out or I got lost. I just had to get away from that thing. The tunnel was endless, its walls seemed to close in on me while the sound of its voice chased me through the dark. I finally reached the door at the top of the stairs, slammed into it, shaking with exhaustion and terror. To my utter shock, the door opened with a lot of ease, and out I stumbled into the back room of the store, staring gasping. But something was different. The store wasn't a mess anymore. The shelves were fully loaded, the lights bright and steady. There was no blood. The store manager was gone. All was normal. But I knew better. I knew that thing was down there, waiting and watching. That it had let me go. Had let me live, for the time being. I didn't waste another second. I sprinted out of the store, not once looking over my shoulder. That was a week ago. In the time since then, I've changed jobs, towns, everything I can to remove that memory from my mind. But every night, when the house is quiet, I hear it. That voice. Help me. And I know, on some deep level, that it's only a matter of time before it comes for me.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit the bell to catch all the new eerie horror stories. See you next time.